So I can't kind of believe that I'm making this video. This is a very different video from me, so hang out with me in this one. This one is a lot. I want to tell you a story about my paternal grandfather. Somewhere in the winter of late 1920, early 1921, in County Kerry, Ireland, my 14-year-old grandfather witnessed his home, his farmhouse, invaded by a paramilitary British force called the Black and Tans, a police force. This home invasion resulted in the death of his mother, my great-grandmother, who was physically ill because she had just given birth to twin boys days before this home invasion. She died at the age of 43. She died from exposure as well as in context of recovering from childbirth and not being well. She had the flu or a cold. I just want you to pause and take that in for a minute about this woman, my great-grandmother. She was aged 43, had just given birth to twins, was probably nursing at home in a farmhouse in rural Ireland, and she died of exposure. The twins were children's number 7 and 8, and that's not including miscarriages or loss. And the average lifespan of a person born in the 1870s, which my great-grandmother was born then, remember this is in 1920, 1921, that lifespan was about 50 years old, and she had just given birth at the age of 43. So she could barely get out of bed and was most likely dragged from her home by these police force constables, the Black and Tans. These were British men, dragged out of the bed into the snow with her twins along with 5 other children. The oldest was 16 to about 9. They had to stay in the cold until the invading men were done ransacking the home. These men may have stayed a long time. They may have used the Thatch family farmhouse for several hours to maybe drink or warm themselves after kicking the family out before going on to the next home in this village that, according to the 1911 census, had 16 homes in this little village, this little area where my grandfather was raised. So my great-grandmother would have given birth to those twins at home, since the nearest hospital was 20 miles away, and that would have been travel by cart and donkey. The birth would have maybe been assisted by an untrained midwife or female relatives, or the oldest child. The oldest of the family was a girl. Her name was Julia, and I've always loved that name. And those twins, they lost their mother. The twins were probably raised by Julia. The twins died in their toddlerhood from food poisoning, maybe from not having a mother to look after them in a time when that country of Ireland had just shifted from a war of independence to a civil war when those 2 twins died when they were toddlers. And they were trying to win their independence from England. And then when they did, Ireland fell into a civil war for about 2 or 3 years. In addition to ransacking that home, this paramilitary force, the Black and Tans, that broke into the family home, stole 2 half-crowns. That's British money, because Ireland was still an unwilling colony of Britain for 800 years as of 1920. The money was a gift from family to celebrate the birth of the twin boys, and 2 half-crowns was maybe the equivalent to like a low week's pay. So it's kind of a lot of money for impoverished Ireland at the time. And the kicker to all this, as it relates to abuse from the government, my great-grandmother was murdered by a paramilitary force that was there because of the parent state. So who were these men? The Black and Tans were a paramilitary force, and they were on paper a legal British constabulary. The reality is they were a roaming gang of sociopaths that were deployed to Ireland to put down a rebellion of the IRA and to terrorize local civilians. And why am I telling you all this? I'm a history fan, but this is also a very personal story. What happened to my 14-year-old grandfather coming home from taking care of livestock and finding his home ransacked? He lost his mother the next day to this home invasion. And the violence, the insult, the loss of money, the rage, the fear, and worrying about his siblings. And I'm telling you this as a childhood trauma therapist because my grandfather's hypervigilance became my father's hypervigilance, which later became mine to heal from. This is how governmental abuse and just general childhood trauma travels through time. So both my grandfather and my father were violent men. They were vigilant about betrayal. They were determined to have never ever have anyone have any power over them in any way. And they were extremely unempathic, and they would abuse close ones around them, their other family. They would abuse them financially around money. While they didn't identify with their abusers, they replicated a lot about what happened to them. And I'm not saying this home invasion was the only thing that happened to my grandfather. There's complex trauma all through his life, and he, and then replicated a lot of it. But I am speaking to you directly now as a descendant, as a result of that event around 1920, winter of 2021. So why was such brutality legal on paper? And to ask, are all laws just because? The British government wouldn't have called it abuse or anything like that, but it's certainly relevant to a situation happening right now in the US. Here's the breakdown. In this video, I'm going to draw parallels of the abusive parent state by looking at the black and tans, who they were. I'm going to also be looking at Hitler's early band of thugs called the SA, which later became the SS. And I'm also going to be looking at the ICE agency in the US and their lasting impact of these paramilitary forces and the damage and the legacy of these forces. Incidentally, governments behave similar to toxic families. There are victims, there are rescuers, there are persecutors. Think that Karpman drama triangle, which is used not just in a home, not just between an abusive relationship, but it can be used in government as well. We often see that in terms of, I'm saving this population over here, so therefore you have to vote for me. So let's get into something called the abusive parent state. The parent, the state, uses a third party to do what they can't accomplish themselves politically. The British Prime Minister or the Lords or the interested financial and economic parties that exploited Ireland's resources for 800 years, and it's all coming up into this event of the revolution around 1920, they're not going to show up themselves and shame the Irish people into submission. Like, we're here and we're protecting you, and who cares if we're taking all your livestock? Who cares if there was a potato famine and we took everything else and sold it as an export? Those guys, they're not going to show up and do this stuff. They're going to have somebody else do that dirty work. They need a brute squad. And what I'm talking about there is the enforcer, the paramilitary. That would be the black and tans in this example. That would be the Hitler's SA that I spoke about, as well as the 2026, 2025 version of ICE, the enforcers. Now let's get into the scapegoat. I'm trying to display, like, who are the roles in all this? There's a scapegoat, which is the civilian. These would be people who are labeled as domestic terrorist or illegal to justify the abuse. Throwing out that term domestic terrorist really isn't new, but it's incredibly effective for propaganda. And as a side note, pay attention to the victim rescuer theme. If you've ever heard of your abusers in your family, use that as a distraction. If you've ever heard this sentiment, look at what you made me do, is a theme to these three paramilitary groups and the enforcer, as well as the impact that they have on the civilian, aka the scapegoat, or other people wrapped up in it who are usually marginalized. So let's get into who were the black and tans. The short answer is the black and tans were predominantly unemployed British World War I veterans. Remember, this happened in 1920. World War I ended in 1918. World War I veterans, with most likely had what they call shell shock at the time, aka PTSD. And think of these men as mercenaries with PTSD from the war, who didn't really care what the work was, just as long as they were employed finally. The British deployed around 10,000 to 13,000 men from Britain to Ireland from 1919 to 1922-ish to support the existing British police force. They were called the IRC, the Royal Irish Constabulary. The IRC were struggling as a police force, fighting the Irish revolutionary forces who were fighting for their independence of getting rid of British rule in Ireland. They are known as the IRA, or the beginnings of the IRA from the 1916 Easter Rising. A lot of this stuff, there's a lot of parties to this, so it's a little bit confusing. And the Irish had a nickname for this British auxiliary paramilitary constabulary kind of force that these World War I veterans, the nickname was Black and Tans, due to the hodgepodge kind of rush uniforms that these British people were given to put down the Irish. And for this deployment of British constables that were sent over simply as temporary constables. Incidentally, for the first Black and Tan member to die in the conflict was killed in County Kerry in the spring of 1920 when they first got there. Here is a picture of a black and tan policing the Dublin train station, carrying a World War I machine gun called a Lewis gun. Okay, now let's ask, why were they invading my grandfather's home in 1920-21? The black and tans most likely forced themselves into my grandfather's farmhouse when he was 14 years old under the auspices of accusing the family of maybe gun running for the IRA, or to find IRA materials, or that they didn't even have to offer a reason and they just did it. These black and tans could have been in a blackout drunken state, which is not outside of historical reporting of the abuse of the civilians. On paper, the black and tans were hired and deployed all across Ireland. And for a little bit of perspective, again, there were 10 to 13,000 black and tans deployed for those 3 years in Ireland. Ireland is roughly the size of South Carolina, or a little bit smaller than the state of Maine, with 4 million people in it. So it's a large military force on a small place. So I'm just trying to say they were around a lot of Ireland, not so much in the north, but a lot around rural south in this area that my grandfather grew up in. So a reality of this is that the black and tans were kind of poorly trained thugs. They were a lot of alcoholics. They were deployed to break the spirit of the Irish civilians and squelch the rebellion of a profoundly oppressed country, which again, up until 1920, that oppression was going on for about 800 years. And what happened? What happened to my family that night in 1920 happened all across Ireland for nearly 2 years, 2.5 years. There were rapes. There was arson. There were towns like Cork or Balbriggan had a large section of those towns set fire. And the black and tans would shoot at firemen trying to put out those fires. They tortured and beat to death IRA suspects. They even shot 14 people, 3 of them children, at a Gaelic football game in Dublin in what is known as Sunday Bloody Sunday. That was a reprisal when the IRA had attacked British intelligence officers, and then the black and tans, in retaliation of that, they went after civilians at an Irish football match. And what is the lasting trauma in the impact from the British parent government by using the black and tans as essentially terrorists while calling the population domestic terrorists? So why didn't the Irish just comply, if that sounds familiar to you? Well, why is because no one likes a boot on their neck, and it tends to piss people off. Weirdly, the presence of the black and tans greatly backfired on the British government, where more and more Irish became extremely sympathetic to the IRA and fighting for their independence. It had the opposite effect. The lasting impact for the Irish was 2 things. Generational trauma. Here I am speaking about it 3 generations down. Violence and hypervigilance in those generations, they're kind of contagious, if not in us on like a cellular level. The black and tans just made the Irish more self-determined. There was a funny thing with those who are abused. What the abuser often makes the mistake about is that victims become hell-bent in a good way about self-determination. Maybe that's why you're choosing to look at these videos that I do. There's also national pride. Each new generation of Irish people, they're informed of what happened 100 years ago with the black and tans, kind of from a never forget kind of place. It's become not just the only national identity, but it's a source of determination, power, and strength. So the lasting impact for the British and the black and tans is essentially failure. State-sponsored abuse always eventually results in political disaster. It looks bad. It smells bad. It's a violent bravado thing that results in your own downfall. And I'm just here spelling out the pattern recognition, which is something that I'm good at. There's also shame. While the black and tans, they were not persecuted in courts, they didn't advertise what they did in their time in Ireland due to that time period being generally extremely unpopular on an international scale. Another fact is the context of colonization and violence. Some of the auxiliary force known as the black and tans, when their deployment in Ireland was over, a lot of them were rehired and sent to go to Palestine and serve as a police force there under British rule, who was struggling with riots in one of their other colonies. So that's the black and tans. Now we're going to move on to something called Hitler's SA, or AKA the stormtroopers, that they became too big for their britches, so to speak. So who were Hitler's SA? AKA something you may have heard the term, the brown shirts. And this is super important. The SA became absorbed as an agency, as a body of a military, paramilitary force. They got absorbed into Hitler's SS as an extremist, hardcore group that was kind of separate and too extreme for the regular German army. And I'm going to come back to that. Here's a picture of them in 1923 attempting to take over the government in the Munich coup, or push, as they call it. That's German for the word force. 1923, Hitler tried to take over the government in Germany. It failed. He got imprisoned. He wrote Mein Kampf in prison. Here is a picture of this group, the SA, in the late 20s or the early 30s. With Hitler, here is the same group preventing Jewish people from entering a university in Vienna. And this, to me, it looks almost performative. I'm not sort of saying it didn't happen, but their body language is sort of, we're here, we're large in charge, deal with it. And also while scapegoating a part of society. And the short answer is, who were the SA? In a very similar way to the Black and Tans, these were German World War I vets again. They were unemployed veterans, and they were members of the Free Corps. They were also another paramilitary group in World War I believe. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, who knows about that. This group felt betrayed. Many Germans felt betrayed by Germany's defeat in World War I, by the Treaty of Versailles, about how the war ended. This group, they loved what Hitler was offering. He was offering power and revenge for losing the war. That would be World War I. The SA were also started in 1921 during Germany's economic crisis. Britain was also in an economic crisis, but they were kind of the victors in World War I. Germany was even sort of more in an economic crisis due to loss of that war to the post-war treaty, again, the Treaty of Versailles, and a lot of political instability. So the SA were a disillusioned group of thugs that grew and grew and grew. And primarily, like on paper, their purpose was to be providing protection for Nazi rallies and assemblies, but also intimidating the Romani, trade unionists, and especially intimidating and persecuting Jews. So this includes brutal street violence, torture, and murder of political opponents, those being either socialist or communist or whatever. Following 1933, when there was a fire of the government building called the Reichstag, which was sort of arson that the Nazis did to stage something, the SA imprisoned around 40,000 to 50,000 people into concentration camps around that time as a result of that fire. The SA also led a lot of anti-Jewish violence, including what we know as the 1938 Kristallnacht program. It's those guys who carried that stuff out. So here's the thing. Remember when I said that Black and Tans were legal on paper, but morally reprehensible? The SA were not officially legal kind of on paper until Hitler became the German chancellor in 1933. As a legitimate body, now with kind of like a legitimate rise. But there's a twist to this, is that I'm going to tell you about that later. I'm going to hold on to that, about that. Hitler becomes official in 1933. What does he do with the SA? What is the lasting impact on this state-sponsored paramilitary group? Well, there's just the profound loss of life and lasting generational trauma from the Holocaust to World War II itself. There's generations of horrific trauma for Jews and anyone who opposed Hitler. Just think of also the lives ruined of homosexuals or Romani or political parties or anybody that spoke out against him, simply if you were a German that got out because knowing that it was all going to be insane. Just thinking about like the emotional impact of simply just that. There's generations of shame and issues for Germans over the years as we've wondered for nearly 100 years about how could this have happened. The aggression from the SA and backing of Hitler and contributing to his installation as a leader led to millions of civilian and military deaths across the globe. Now I want to get into DHS and ICE in comparison of these three things. The third paramilitary group I'm discussing is ICE. The DHS is using a paramilitary strategies like a military force, and they have excessive federal funding now and backing as of the big, beautiful bill as of 2025. They are highly supplied. They even have surveillance, such as makeshift temporary cell phone towers that you're on the street, your cell phone just links up to that tower and they can look at what's going on with you and your phone, and that's a way of surveillance. And yes, they are designed to enforce problems of immigration. However, many are seeing the current political climate in the US as the Trump administration's enforcers, as personal enforcers, as in the horrific case in Minneapolis of Operation Metro Surge. In the present, we are very familiar with this agency over here. Now let's get into what are the parallels between these three groups. Parallel number one, the recruitment, and which I believe is recruiting men with nothing to lose. I believe one of the most dangerous people in society is someone who's got nothing to lose. Who gets hired for these paramilitary jobs and a surge of hiring around those jobs? Well, the black and tans, again, unemployed, World War I, lower middle class veterans with shell shock, aka PTSD, men who were already maybe dead inside from the trenches and needed a paycheck or maybe wanted to return to a sense of power, personal power, perhaps even without the damage to World War I that they experienced. Perhaps these were men who simply loved violence and who could sign up for that. Here is a recruitment poster for the black and tans offering employment. Here's a section of that poster that says, especially if you're ex-serviceman. So now the recruitment around Hitler's SA, the stormtroopers, the brown shirts. These were disillusioned and unemployed World War I veterans, again with probably PTSD. And these are the forgotten men of a ruined economy in a ruined national honor. Hitler gave them a brown shirt and an enemy to blame, perhaps even without the damage from World War I. Again, like the black and tans, maybe these men just loved violence. Hitler started them on a political national revenge campaign of all those who betrayed Germany and in losing the war in German society as an example of scapegoating other parties. We lost the war because of these people, and doing that on a national scale. There is currently a parallel seeing the Trump administration using national pride as a disguise for revenge against possible political enemies, such as ICE doing raids in a highly blue state. And you can look at the numbers about where states are at in terms of immigration problems and just think about that. Here's an SA recruitment poster offering a return to national honor with the caption, "Your spirit has given me honor again." That is a World War I German uniform and a 1920s, 1930s brown shirt uniform of the SA. A lot of SA stuff is kind of like, oh, no, World War I isn't over yet, let's go. That's a sentiment to that. Okay, so now let's look at ICE. Recruited from veterans and police forces who are promised immunity, these agents are supported around not showing their faces. They're supported to wear masks. And the agency has more than doubled its officers and agents, growing from roughly 10,000 strong to over 22,000 strong in less than a year from 2025 to 2026. And based on some recent news reports in the US, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is ICE, is engaging in aggressive recruitment campaigns that might be using rhetoric and memes and themes often associated with far-right groups, including the Proud Boys and including some white nationalists. I believe that they have put up a slogan that's in a popularized white nationalist song on the DHS Instagram page. ICE tends to hire people who can speak certain languages. They prefer if you have a background in police force or military work. There's also reports that hiring is kind of chaotic, where criminal records, something called a query, is not fully completed and communication is rushed. Those agents may have domestic violence records not fully processed, and then they're hired. Training is also rushed to meet the administration's push to this stuff. Here's a nice recruitment poster with a theme of a moral call, potentially for a failing nation. So what motivates people to take these jobs? Is it just a job? Might there be a pull towards violence and rhetoric like we see in the other two groups, or strong political affiliations, while being supported that you're doing heroic work? So here's the thing. The parent state tends to look for men with kind of a moral injury, if not maybe even a narcissistic injury in my mind from where I sit, or they may have potentially have PTSD, or they can weaponize their lack of empathy. Remember in those examples, they don't want peacekeepers. They want enforcers. They don't really want to train them for public safety, it seems. They want to call it safety on a national scale, but it seems to be anything but that. And they call it something that there's a great danger in the nation that you need to fix. So the state finds men who might feel powerless due to war or poverty or to their own feeling a sense of national betrayal, and they will give them a badge and they will allow them to transfer those feelings of powerless onto a scapegoat in society. It's a classic, very much narcissistic, whether it's in a family or a government, it's like a classic narcissistic recruitment tactic. Here's parallel number 2, and I know the first parallel was a lot: the license to terrorize, the legal cover. How the violence is sanitized on paper. The tactic is go after the domestic terrorists, go after the worst of the worst. In Ireland, it was the IRA suspects. In Germany, it was Jews, political enemies, homosexuals, anybody that was different, anyone who spoke up against Hitler. In the US, and especially in the case of Minneapolis, it's domestic terrorists, aka protesters, or the undocumented. Then there's the uniforms. These are uniforms of fear. The black and tans had this hodgepodge uniform. In Germany, in the late 20s and 30s, you knew what a brown shirt was. You could see them coming. And right now in the US, you can recognize ICE by their camo, by their tactical stuff, especially with that they have a mask on. These aren't just clothes. They're designed to dehumanize the agent. So they can't be held really accountable, and they're also labeled as doing heroes' work or even God's work. The comparison is when the agent is told that they are immune, whether that's a black and tan or ICE or the SA, they stop being citizens and start being kind of sociopathic. That's a psychological thing when you've kind of given a disguise to somebody, a uniform. There is nothing more dangerous, again, in my mind, than somebody who has nothing to lose. And if you don't have your identity to lose or public shame, that's dangerous. And perhaps the most important difference in these paramilitary groups is the SA and the black and tans did not wear masks. The mask add a very purposeful and damaging and damning element to this, even in the way that Nazis didn't do that. So there is something very diabolical about enforcers not being willing to be identified. And again, I think in the black and tans, no one had a cell phone in those days. A lot could just be hearsay, right? The mask is an ultimate tool, I would say, of the abusive parent state. It allows the enforcer to fully de-identify. And when you take away a man's face, you take away his conscience. It's a signal from the state that says, I will protect you from the consequences of your soul. Do whatever you have to do. Here's parallel number 3. And I know I'm throwing a lot at you. I know I'm talking very fast. The discard. This is the most important part of this video. What is the fate of the enforcer? This is what I really wanted to come back earlier when I was talking about Hitler's SA. These men, like the golden child in our families, can be discarded too sometimes. Sometimes the toxic parent will betray the enforcer, as we see with that guy Greg Bovino, when they no longer serve a purpose, or when the enforcer might make you look bad. But yet we also see the enforcer still staying loyal even after they're discarded. So it's a bit of a head trip. For example, in 1934, remember there's the SA. 1933, there's the Reichstag fire. Germany decides to give Hitler the chancellery. He is the president, the chancellor of Germany. In 1934, after that, there's something called the event of the Night of the Long Knives. Once Hitler became chancellor, the thuggish SA, the stormtroopers, these brown shirts, they were larger than the regular German military, and they made Hitler look bad about how violent they were or lower middle class they were. And he didn't exactly need them anymore, so he had their leader shot. You can look up a guy named Ernest Röhm, leader of the SA. He's got a very interesting story if you just want to Google that. Now the discard of the black and tans. When Ireland gained its independence, the British didn't give the black and tans any medals, but they were offered more work. This is why I love history. There's so many parallels. It's kind of spooky in the way that many black and tans went to continue their brutality in another colony, being Palestine. And after that, the black and tans just kind of faded away into shame and oblivion. So England still carries a long-standing shame for using such broken men as murderers and rapists and as thugs that really tried to break the Irish spirit. The SA, Hitler's SA, thought they were the golden children. They thought Hitler loved them for their loyalty and for their violence. But in the architecture abuse, the golden child is just really a tool. Take that in. If you have a sibling that's a golden child, the second the SA made the parent state look bad and they became a liability to the regular military and to the international community, he had them liquidated. And if you're an agent today, an ICE agent today, you aren't really the hero. You might be the tool currently being used to build a house that you won't be allowed to live in later. It's kind of what I'm getting at in this video. What am I getting at, for the love of God? I know I'm kind of talking a lot here. Here's the parallel that I'm thinking of, a hypothetical. In my opinion, as someone who is in the world of pattern recognition again, what is going to happen to ICE agents who were promised immunity once the administration changes or the public outcry becomes too loud? What is going to happen to them when history needs to describe these times? What is going to happen to Trump after MAGA and after the Republicans want to maybe distance themselves from what happened in Minneapolis under Operation Metro Surge, those 2 murders? And I have to directly just say it. If you are an ICE agent, this administration, they're not known for lasting loyalty for those who work for them on the inside, right? How many relationships around Donald Trump get real sour real fast? In other words, you're completely loyal, but there's a pattern recognition that I'm thinking of, is that loyal people to Trump can quickly become enemies. I can certainly hear those in the current administration say, I had nothing to do with it. That's all on those agents. I didn't know anything about anything. That kind of sounds familiar. Again, through history, the SA were loyal. They would lay down their life for Hitler. And when things got too visible or too messy, they were discarded and their identity was erased inside the regime. And I think every historical example of paramilitaries, legal abuse, there comes a moment where the state must choose between its own survival and the loyalty to its enforcers. The parent state always chooses its own survival. Might ICE be devalued and moved on from the golden child to potentially a scapegoat, as we see how roles shift in a family system like that? So whether it's a family or a government or an agency, I'm always baffled as to how enforcers can kind of throw their life away for an abusive parent or parent state. This is my work, and I still haven't fully been able to figure that out. Here are some final thoughts, and these will feel kind of scattered. So my grandfather wasn't home when his mother was dragged out into the snow in January or December, but he did come home to the aftermath, and that aftermath lived in him. And then that lived in my father, and then it lived in me. Seeing residents in Minneapolis, undocumented or not, dragged out in the snow, door-to-door harassment, beatings, shootings, murder, along with the daily terror of just vans popping up in your neighborhood, that's going to impact you. That's going to stay with people for a long time. Whether it's 1920 in County Kerry, Ireland, or 2026 in Minneapolis, the parent state follows a blueprint. It creates an enforcer, targets a scapegoat, and then washes its hands of the blood. If you're an Asian today, look at the black and tans, look at the SA, look, the state doesn't love you. And it's weaponizing a moral injury that you might have, and it will discard you potentially the moment you might become a political liability. My grandfather's home invasion was 106 years ago. The trauma just didn't sort of pocket in 1920 and kind of filter out. It just went through the generations until someone had to kind of do something different. That is why we just can't comply with abuse, because our grandchildren will be the ones paying the price about whether you're the enforcer or whether you're labeled as the one who was the domestic terrorist. And I want to be clear about this. Nations have to manage their borders. It's a political reality. What we're talking about here isn't really policy. It's weaponizing of a problem to justify state-sponsored terror and violence. We have to separate the logistics around from what the abuse is, because we can accomplish the logistics without the abuse, is what I'm trying to get at. The real point is the trauma to the people of Minneapolis or Dublin or Cork or Palestine or County Kerry or the Sudan or El Salvador. My 3 examples are not the only examples in paramilitary abuse. So how long does the abuse from the parent government last? Again, that home invasion in Kerry was 106 years ago. You know what I mean? We're coming up on 100 years of when the SA first started brutal campaigns through the streets of German cities and towns. From the pattern recognition, from what I see, the use of force always backfires both on the enforcer and the parent state. New generations of Irish embrace the national pride when the British declared the war with Ireland and the war with the IRA was unwinnable, despite the black and tans. New generation of people across the globe detest what the SA did. And what's their legacy of those guys? Kind of how shitty, like that's your mark on the world. My grandfather's family, many Irish were impoverished. They were the illegal folks in the eyes of the British Crown, and they were defenseless. But 100 years later, we're here still telling their story, relevant to ICE in the US today. History has a long memory. And pattern recognition, Donald Trump tends to use people and discards them. That was a lot. I would love to hear what you think. I would love to hear in your family history, have you been affected by a parent state? Do you draw parallels between the parent state and your own family system in childhood trauma. It's always important to keep talking about these things, especially in the present, when the present is the source of the trauma, because this is not about our bodies just saying it's happening again. It's literally happening again. So thanks for staying with me. I know that this was a lot. May you be filled with loving kindness. May you be well. May you be peaceful and at ease, and may you be joyous. And I will see you next time.